Okay, so now spinal nerves to and from the spinal cord. So a number of these you have to learn in the lab as well, just so we know how we can innervate, get sensory information from different areas of the body, as well as send mostly somatic responses to these skeletal muscles to move these areas of the body as well. When we look at them, lots of different spinal nerves coming out. In fact, they are categorized much like, where's my stylus, much like when we were looking at the different vertebrae, right? We have those intervertebral foramina. Those are where the spinal nerves are coming out. And so just like we have cervical and thoracic and lumbar and sacral and coccyx or coccygeal areas of the spinal column, we have regions of spinal nerves as well, right? So there were 7, 12, and 5 different vertebrae, and remember that our spinal nerves are coming out between. So there are 8 pair of cervical nerves, 12 of the thoracic, 5 of the lumbar, and then 5 and 1 of the sacral and coccygeal. So when we look at those, we can see where those are coming out. So this is where we get an extra one, right? So we get 8 there. That's a more reasonable time to eat breakfast, right? Rather than 7. 8, 12, and 5 are where we get our major nerves coming out, but they're also organized into plexuses, right? So we had ganglia, we talked about ganglia and kind of housings and things like that. And when we look at groupings, now we're looking at groupings of nerves, not neurons themselves, but nerves, bundles of nerves that are going to and from a particular area of the body. So there is what's called the cervical plexus, a main bundle that's going into and out of the neck region, a main bundle that's going into the upper limb. We call that the brachial plexus. There's a lumbar plexus that comes out of the lumbar region that goes down to the lower limb. There's also a sacral plexus that also goes down to the lower limb. So those are major bundles, like we said. All right, one of the other things that we saw when we were looking at the spinal cord is we noticed, like we said, that there are many pathways. Excuse me. So there's a reflex. We'll talk about reflexes coming up. All right, sensory information coming in, tickling, tickling. What are we going to do about it? Motor response coming out, in any case. So when we look at these different spinal pathways, right, remember that, like for instance, when you're looking at the cross-section of the spinal cord in the lab, once we get out here, now we're getting to actual spinal nerves. And we see that there's a dorsal ramus that goes to innervate the posterior part of the body, right, to get sensory and motor information going to the back. And then there is a ventral ramus, which curves around and is going to innervate, whoop, 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 the front part of the body, right, the anterior aspect instead. We also have remember there's a rami communicantes, which sounds like picantes, that goes to our sympathetic chain ganglion that goes in parallel to the spinal cord as well. So this is the way that we can get this information, sensory information, from these areas of the body, and motor responses to these areas of the body. So you see that, right? So here's the dorsal ramus going to the dorsal part of the body. This is the back. And then the ventral is going to innervate the sides and the front, like we see here. So these plexuses, like we said, are areas or groupings of nerves that are going to and from specific areas. So this is a cervical plexus. Of the cervical plexus in terms of lab, you only had to know the phrenic nerve. So the phrenic nerve is going down and innervating the diaphragm, that umbrella-shaped skeletal muscle that allows us to ventilate the lungs. But you can see that there's a lot of other ones too that are heading through the neck. When we get to the brachial plexus, there's a number that you have to know here. Lots of different branches, but what you need to know are, for instance, these ones that we see here. The axillary, we see it going to the shoulder, right, and to the armpit. Remember, that's the axillary region. Musculocutaneous is innervating the skin and the muscle of the arm. Radial goes down and handles the lateral aspect. Ulnar, the medial aspect, and then median goes right down the middle instead. From there, we can see the pathways extending all the way down. And then, when we continue on, we look at the lumbar plexus. So the lumbar plexus is going through that lumbar region, And it's basically handling a lot of the anterior side of the lower limb. So we'll see that there's a few that you have to know. So for instance, the femoral, I wonder where that goes. Goes next to the femur, right? So we can see that a lot of the lumbar ones come down the anterior side that we see through there. You can even see, look, there's an obturator nerve. Remember you learned that obturator foramen? Look, there's an obturator nerve that passes through it. Now, it's nowhere near as big as the big hole, but that allows for the pathway to head down there to innervate, for instance, like our adductor muscles and places like that. All right, so we have the femoral nerve coming down, kind of handling the anterior side. When we get to the sacral plexus, one of the biggest ones we have that we see here is the sciatic. So the sciatic nerve goes down the back. You hear about people with sciatica, etc. So it goes and innervates the posterior side, and it even splits. So you can see how it splits right here. It splits to become the fibular and the tibial. So the fibular goes along the lateral side, goes on to the anterior side, to the front, whereas the tibial stays along the posterior side instead. So lots of different ways that we can cover the different regions of the body. And as I mentioned, some people have problems with sciatica where the nerve is being impinged upon because of the organization, right? Those discs, those intervertebral discs get compacted, and that's where, in those intervertebral foramina, right, that's where those nerves are coming out. And so once you start pinching those nerves, those pathways, like bending a wire, right, are going to be impacted as well. All right, one of the things that we were seeing in terms of the different regions of the body, we said some of them are innervating muscles and getting sensory information coming in from the muscles, from the skin, etc. And what we find is that all of these different spinal nerves end up handling different areas of the body, much like we saw in different areas of the brain are perceiving that information from the body too. These are called dermatomes. So remember epidermis, dermis, etc. The dermatomes are the areas of the surface of our body that are being sensed, if you will, or that are relaying sensory information by these different spinal nerves. So you can see, right, our cervical ones handling the head and the shoulders and even the forearms and the arms. The thoracic ones that we see through here are handling the torso. That makes sense. The lumbar are handling mainly the anterior side. And the sacral are basically handling the posterior side, as well as, right, the gluteal region, and we can see the genitals are also handled by the sciatic region. So dermatomes are handling them. So if they find that there's tingling or a nerve sensation or something like that, or numbness, they can route it without, they're going to do x-rays, they're going to do different types of assessments, but that's the way that they can start getting an idea about where the issue is along these spinal nerves as well. Okay, so when we're talking about this peripheral nervous system and getting this information in and getting it out again, we talked about the sensory information coming in these different types of receptors, but there's also these peripheral motor endings. And these ones we've seen before, right? So we talked about the somatic nervous system where we are innervating the skeletal muscle. We talked about the autonomic nervous system where we are innervating visceral muscle as well as glands, etc. And so the neuromuscular junction that we mentioned before, that's where we're getting this motor response going out to these skeletal muscles. So this isn't anything new here, right? Remember, here's our motor neuron. Right here, it's going to interact with the skeletal muscle at the motor end plate. Remember that through a series of steps, we are going to release neurotransmitters from it. We have to stimulate that cell. So for instance, as the action potential comes down, these voltage-gated channels are going to let calcium flood into the axon terminal. That then stimulates these bags, these vesicles full of neurotransmitter to migrate to the end, or the membrane, if you will, right near the end of the axon terminal, and then to merge with that plasma membrane and dump out their acetylcholine. It's going to diffuse across the synapse, across that cleft, and it's going to bind to chemically gated channels. And the more those chemically gated channels bind that receptor, the more this muscle cell is going to be stimulated, right? Greater potential, and the more it gets stimulated, it will then ultimately generate an action potential. Now this is what it looks like in terms of a skeletal muscle. Remember when we were talking about smooth muscle? Smooth muscle innervation is a little bit different, right? These are autonomic coming down. It's not just innervating like we see kind of one part of one very large skeletal muscle cell. We see there's a lot of branching here in what are called varicosities. And the varicosities for these nerve fibers make sure that a lot of neurotransmitters are released across all of this area of smooth muscle. So it responds. Remember that the smooth muscle is going to be responding basically as one, right? So it's in sync. So it forms a syncytium, and this is one of the ways that we do that, is that we end up innervating it by basically dumping all this neurotransmitter all over it so that they can respond as ones. Now remember, for sensory information, we had different places where we were perceiving it. Motor control, like we talked about in the central nervous system, also comes from different regions, right? So when we looked at it, like we saw before, there's going to be areas of what we call pre-command. So the cerebellum, those basal nuclei, etc. There's the projection level, which is out of the motor cortex, when we talk about up in the cerebrum as well. And then there's the segmental level, is which area of the spinal cord do we need to, for instance, go down and then exit out in order to get to that particular skeletal muscle, etc. So, like we said, pre-command level is cerebellum, right? We're coordinating it, etc., and regulating it, monitoring muscle tone so that we can make sure that the muscles are ready. When we get to the projection level, this is out of, right, primary motor cortex. We also have other gyri that are associated with it as well, right? Primary motor cortex and prefrontal cortex and things like that. So lots of different areas of the brain that are going to be involved. Now, ultimately, like we said, we're going to have the sensory information coming in, we're going to be deciding about it, and then we're going to have a motor response coming out. It's the same regardless of whether we're really thinking about something and processing it, right? Receptor gets the information, sensory information takes it, sensory neurons take it in, we are processing it with their integration centers, right, with our interneurons, etc. Then we have a motor response coming out, and then we're going to have an effector that's going to produce an effect as a response. So those 5 steps are what happens regardless of whether we are processing and being creative with something, what do we want to draw or whatever, how do we feel about something, or whether it's just a simple reflex as well. We have to have all 5 of those steps. So our last section, our 4th section for this lecture, talks about the very simple type of response systems that we call reflexes. So we'll see that coming up.